Welcome, Scott. How are you?
I'm great, thank you, Dev. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for your time today. And I've been meaning to sit with you to understand your views on the economic policy and economic status and where we are. But I would want you to give a bit of an historical context for us to understand where the economy have landed in the last 20 years.
So, at the Institute of Public Affairs, we are, as you know, Dev, very much committed to freedom and the free enterprise system, not just because it creates prosperity, although it does, and actually creates the sort of wealth that we need in order to ensure that everybody in society can get ahead, but because a system in which people can make their own choices is the one that's most conducive to human flourishing. There will always be a role for governments, but we need limited government, small government, and not you know, a reasonable level of taxation, and we can have a discussion about what that might be. My view is much lower than it currently is, and so there's a general experience that we have as we look at history that the countries that have thrived the most are those which have managed to unleash the entrepreneurial forces within society and give people the freedom to pursue opportunities, to make their own decisions about their own lives, about what they study, what they work in, how they build their careers. And so when we look at the performance of the economy over the last 20 years, and there's a widespread realisation now that the performance has not been great, that certainly ever since the GFC, so we're going back then to 2010, 2011, 2012, we've been in a period where we've had low growth, low productivity, we've been adding debt, and government just seems to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's crowding out the private sector. It's been disguised. Long-term concerns have been disguised by the fact that we've still had good prices for our commodities, and we're still able to export. And also there's government spending on infrastructure right across the country, which creates a stream of jobs that create an appearance of economic growth. And also we have unprecedented levels of immigration, which means, if you're in retail, that's great. More people, more spending, it looks like economic growth. But the results have been, as IPA research started to show nearly 3 or 4 years ago now, on a per capita basis, we were actually going backwards. So we started talking about the per capita recession, and that's now been generally accepted. So we can dive into it, and I should let you ask the questions, but that's sort of an overall context. So because, as I say, that most people will appreciate that the economy is not doing as well as it should, but I would keep that in the framework of this longer-term trend towards more and more government running deficits, increasing debt, and actually reducing the productivity in the economy through some of the measures that they've taken. So these are the concerns that we have.
I want you to delve a bit more on the idea of the free enterprise, which you used at your opening line. The idea of free enterprise, how it is explained in the context of when you have government regulations around it, when you have associations of people who are workers coming together and then controlling and having to negotiate things. So in those and open markets, and then not very strong tariffs on many things. So how do you see free enterprise performing or playing a role? But before that, if you can explain what it is.
So a free enterprise arises from what Adam Smith called the human propensity to truck, barter and exchange. Essentially, if you have something that I want and I have something that you want, we can actually organise a trade, and we'll do that. And in a reasonably ordered society, we do that. We're in a society where we've built trust and we have institutions. So let's say we actually contract to do that, and you say you're going to deliver X and you don't deliver X. Well, then we need the state to enforce contracts. We need the rule of law. We need impartial court systems. And this is sort of like the infrastructure of commerce that governments are very important for. And you look at a country like Singapore, which has become a centre of trade right across the Asia Pacific because people trust their courts to enforce contracts. So the free enterprise system starts with that idea of people just going about their business. And when it is the preponderant force in society, that also means that resources are allocated through the price mechanism and price discovery. And if it sounds like I'm getting a little bit philosophical, it's because I am. And the beauty of the price mechanism is that it's adjusting millions of times a day across multiple markets for reasons that we actually don't know. All you know is that that thing you want, the price just went up. And if the price went up, you're going to buy a bit less of it. If the price comes down, you might buy a bit more of it. It's something you want, but you're responding to the price. And governments, on the other hand, like to feel that they can pull the levers on things. Paul Keating famously talked about pulling the levers of the economy. And this really is the hubris, the planner's fallacy, that you can pull the levers of the economy, that you can make plans for its future directions, that you can direct investment to where governments think it is most needed. And when governments do it, you're outside the price mechanism. So it's not responding to the price signals in the economy, and it's taking resources away from individuals through the taxation system, or it's borrowing, in which case you're taking it away from future generations, and spending it on things that are less productive. And I cringe every time I hear our federal government talking about how they're investing in this and investing in that. And what they mean is they're spending money. They're spending taxpayers' money on things. And if you look at something like renewable energy, wind and solar projects, they are inefficient providers of energy. So it is an investment in terms of the amount of money that's spent on them, but it's actually making the economy less productive. So whereas the free enterprise system would allow the actual market signals to bring forward the most efficient investment option. So,
Okay. From there, what have you seen in the last 10 years? What has worked in terms of economic policy? What kind of control or levers which work and which fail? Because as the grandmaster, you would say, yes, I want to move this and then pull that back. But things do not react the same. What are the great failures and great wins?
So we had a period of economic reform in Australia through the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, which was bipartisan in the sense that both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party contributed to that. We finished up with a system which had lower tariffs, where the size of government was brought under control. In fact, at the Institute of Public Affairs, we have a magazine, and I came across an article by the Labor Treasurer Paul Keating in 1993, crowing about the Labor government's delivery of budgets that had reduced the size of government. He was quite proud of that, and he said compared to the Liberals, they'd done a much better job, and he was absolutely correct. We also saw improvements in the industrial relations system, which enabled individuals to contract with each other, companies to employ individuals on contracts. This had a material benefit to WA in particular. There'd been a terrible industrial relations environment in the projects in the Pilbara, and this new industrial relations framework really turned that around. And so that was really the era of reform. And as I say, ever since the GFC, things have been pretty much going backwards. We saw the Rudd-Gillard years where there was an expansion in some of the social programs and a re-regulation of the industrial relations systems through the Fair Work Act, an immediate sort of productivity killer. We saw 3 terms of the coalition government where they were unable to marshal the forces, if you like, intellectually, politically, or through votes in the Senate to achieve lasting reform. They perhaps slowed the growth in the size of government. weren't quite able to deliver to deliver surpluses. And so it was, in retrospect, a sort of a holding pattern, if you like. And then under the Albanese government, we've had, I don't think people appreciate what rapid changes that we've had in a range of ways that are completely destructive of productivity. So we are the re-regulation of the industrial relations system, which basically has now made us has made us a very difficult country in which companies can invest in long-term projects. There's a lot of, it's not just the cost, it's the uncertainty, it's the ability to manage being taken away through the unions. The size of government is now at its highest level in 40 years. So the last federal budget, 27% of GDP is now taken up by the federal government. So that's like a pandemic era level of spending. So instead of reverting to the levels that we had seen, the last budget delivered by Jim Chalmers actually maintained that. So there hasn't really been any meaningful economic reforms in the last 20 years that I can point to, which have actually made us better off as a nation. And that's what's driving the productivity crisis, which is driving us into per capita recession.
The spending during COVID took a big hit on the economy, as in you were spending the money we never had, and we borrowed, and then from that point of view, how is that as a economic policy or a fiscal policy from a point of view of, providing cash in hands of everyday citizens so that the economy keeps on moving? So it's the false narrative from an economic point of view that it's dead, but you're pushing it further hard through your own money or borrowed money.
Yeah, it was certainly a period in which there were respectable arguments for the social support necessary during that time. There were obviously people unable to work for whatever reasons, particularly in areas that had been locked down. But it was a period in which we sort of collectively lost our minds, and in the sense that once you've decided that you're going to spend the first, 100 billion, well, another 100 billion or another 100 billion doesn't seem to matter. And JobKeeper was famously a policy that didn't have any clawback mechanisms, so companies could, organisations could claim JobKeeper based on projections of their lost revenue, and then the ATO didn't go and look at whether or not their projections had actually been realised. So it was that sort of climate in Canberra of which all fiscal responsibility was lost, and what that does is it sort of breaks the culture of fiscal responsibility, and I think there's also a concern that on the recipient side in society, you've then converted a large segment of the population to being recipients of government welfare that they may not have been in the past, and it furthers the culture of dependency, and it takes us away again from private sector activity, and it just makes the government the great provider. So there were reasons why it was done at the time. We had concerns at the time. But certainly I think there are long-term cultural effects on the way Canberra is run, and also long-term cultural effects in society. And there were people, there's people falling out of the workforce all the time that we don't seem to have a pathway back for them. It's you don't see it in the unemployment rate, of course, because they're outside of the labour force. And so that was one of the experiences of that pandemic period.
As a wealthy and reformed societies, the responsibility of government and organizations to support the weak and the vulnerable of your communities, and through voluntary effort and through structured effort and resources. How do you see that panning out within the Australian context in terms of how has the welfare state evolved in the last 20 years, and not just through the pandemic, but the last 20 years, how it has evolved?
So there are, I will, since I've started off in a philosophical mode, I may as well continue it. So there, quite apart from the compassionate arguments for looking after the vulnerable in society, even Friedrich Hayek, the apostle of free market liberalism, said, "Oh well, we even when he wrote in The Road to Serfdom, he said, well, we should have a welfare state, because if people are so uncertain about their futures, if they're feeling so fearful of the vicissitudes of the market, that they may be losing their job and be thrown into poverty and not have anything to fall back on, to give a baseline level of security that people are confident as they go about their lives and engage in market processes and build their careers. Let's have a welfare system. So, to cope not just with illness and disability, but just the vicissitudes of life. So it's a necessary part of modern society, and it's a good thing. What though tends to happen is, once you've built a welfare state, it has a dynamic all of its own. Whenever a scheme is designed, and this appears to be the story in the National Disability Insurance Scheme, a scheme that was originally designed for what you might call conventional or traditional notions of disability, which now, I think at last count, and Deb, I might defer to your knowledge, but when you're talking about sort of 500,000 people on the NDIS, you're talking about an expansion of the definition of what is disabled, an inability of the system to remain focused on those who were the original intended beneficiaries. And that's really been the pattern of the welfare state ever since it was created in the post-war period across the Western world. We used to have a thing with the disability support pension, and I did some work during the term of the last Liberal government, where they had actually made significant inroads into getting people off the disability support pension and back into the workforce. There were people in that situation who were capable of returning to work, but they needed to be worked with. They needed positive programs, and that was done. But then now with the NDIS, we've just gone back in the other direction, and so that's a culture of welfare dependency, which is not only difficult for taxpayers. It is not actually conducive to human flourishing. When you have multi-generational welfare families where no significant others within the extended family are actually in paid employment, whether it's through unemployment or disability or whatever, then that's corrosive of human flourishing, of individuals' capacity. It's not a great environment in which to raise children, I would submit, because it means it's the penalty of low expectations as well. So that seems to be the ongoing challenge of the welfare state. In the abstract, we must have a welfare state. We must look after the vulnerable. We must give people a baseline level of security. But whenever you actually establish one, it just has a dynamic all of its own, and it rapidly becomes unaffordable and actually innovating of human potential.
Wow. In terms of the productivity from a younger point of view, as well as when you get unemployment rates at different levels, when you find unemployment rates from a young people point of view, or people getting into the system of working and getting employed, what are the trends you're seeing, that more people are entering into the workforce market and less people leaving, and what's that the economy of workforce looking like?
Well, one of the things that we see even in WA, of course, is the difficulty of that businesses actually have of getting skilled workers. There are sort of workforce shortages all over the country. Unemployment rates are technically quite low, and I think it is related to what we've talked about, which is people outside of the workforce. We also have another feature of the welfare system that really has to be looked at is for your students, pensioners, veterans, there are these incredibly high marginal rates penalty rates that are applied if they try and work. Surveys have shown that there are many, say, age pensioners who'd be quite happy to work a couple of days a week and contribute some, get a bit of extra money, contribute something back into society, maybe help out the grandkids, or just do it to stay stimulated and engaged with the community. But with the income tests that are applied to age pensions, 80% of that might go back to government. So you've earned another $200, which you get to keep about 40. So you don't do it. So one of the labour market features that we've had is really this strange paradox that there are more and more people who are sitting outside of the labour force, and companies can't actually get the workers that they need. That's a real challenge. And I think, I don't think anyone wants to work for anyone wants to be taxed at 80% of their earnings, and we should actually do something about that.
Could you also draw your insights towards, the status of the energy economy, the status federally, nationally, as well as, if you can give some views what's happening in Western Australia, and where you see the gaps are, and what is the definition of energy mix, and what should be part of the energy mix?
Yeah, so we're in heading in completely the wrong direction at the moment. So let's use the phrase energy mix, and you can build respectable arguments that a bit of diversification in energy mix is a good thing. And for instance, there are those who like, for some reason, wind energy and solar energy, even though they're completely intermittent. They're subject to the vagaries of the weather. They're quite expensive. Solar panels have a limited life, and if you look at the energy that goes into producing them, their so-called claimed emissions benefits are not as great as claimed. But let's assume that you can have a certain amount of solar and wind in a grid, but an energy grid really needs base load dispatchable energy. And the classic sources of those are coal or nuclear or gas or hydroelectricity if you've got it. WA doesn't, Tasmania does, yay for Tasmania, but there's not, apart from the Snowy Mountains scheme, there's not a lot of hydro in Australia. So, and what we've done is, rather than have an energy mix with a little bit of wind and solar, we are jamming more and more wind and solar into the grid. So we're adding less efficient forms of energy, which is reducing the productivity. It's putting strain on the grid, and it's increasing prices, because every time you add wind and solar, you also need to add the backup for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. You have governments having now subsidised solar and wind into the system. Now they're subsidising the batteries as well. That's at the grid level. Same thing happening with rooftop solar. You get government subsidies to put rooftop solar on your house. That's great if you've got a house. If you don't have a house, you can't get it. It's actually a transfer of wealth from the poor and the working class to the middle and upper classes, those who have freestanding houses with roofs that they can put rooftop solar on. So having been subsidised into that, governments are now saying, "Oh, we'll also subsidise the home batteries," because the grid isn't coping with it. So the direction of energy policy in this country, wrapped up under the rubric of net zero, is pretty disastrous, actually, and that's why prices are increasing. We've gone from having some of the cheapest electricity in the world to some of the most expensive, and the reliability of the grid itself is coming into question. We don't want to finish up like Spain, which had these blackouts recently. That's a system very reliant on solar energy, and as soon as there was a big swing in the amount of solar coming out, the whole grid collapsed. We don't want to get into that situation.
As we're talking philosophy, energy being very scientific, very calculative, you can calculate everything, Science can't be, philosophical, but is the idea net zero philosophy?
Well, net zero is it is an interesting.
Or is it a fact? Is it true or a falsehood?
Well, I think it's built on a falsehood. I mean, there's a number of ways at it. So this is, something that came out. Christiana Figueres and a group of women sitting in a country house in Scotland plotted out net zero, sold it to the United Nations, and then it's been signed on to by, I should say, a limited number of countries. Like there's about 33 countries around the world that have signed on to this idea that by 2050 will be net zero emissions, and that's only about a third of the world. So China hasn't signed on to the net zero by 2050. India certainly has not, and now America's walked away. So China and India are just so rapidly increasing. They're remarkable economic success stories. The coal plants that China's building. But anyway, to come back to the philosophy, you asked, is it a question of philosophy? It is actually built on a nonsense because anthropogenic carbon emissions are about 3% of the total carbon cycle. So we're really talking about an accounting fiction that we're going to ignore all the natural sources and sinks of carbon and other greenhouse gases, and we're just going to focus on the anthropogenic bit. And then through carbon accounting, we're going to set this target. So it's and in Australia, where we are now down to, I think we produce about 1.1% of global emissions. So it is built fundamentally on a false premise because it's an imaginary target for an imaginary problem.
And then from there, because an energy independent country can be a strong country. If you can, you are energy sufficient, you can defend yourself in many ways. And it's a very strong national defense argument as well to be energy independent or sufficient. From a point of view of defense as well, and there have been conversations across the last 4, 5 years and 10 years that one is defense spending, second is the geopolitical challenges we are facing at all the time, and then things keep on happening. There are small triggers here and there. What's your observation from the past and then now where we are?
So we produced a paper in 2023, which we called Energy Security is National Security, because you're absolutely right, Dev. If you haven't got a secure energy system domestically, it's very hard to build a national security framework. It's not necessarily self-sufficient in every single form of energy, but certainly you need things like fuel reserves, and and you certainly can't do it, say, with an electricity grid built on solar and wind energy. I mean, the solar panels come from China. So in the baseload system that we have, everyone talks about these ageing coal plants. That's a term of propaganda. Coal plants, properly maintained, do run for decades and decades and decades. And with a bit of refurbishment, it'd be nothing to get 50 or 60 years out of a coal plant. The fact that and even something like Cogan Creek in Queensland was only commissioned in 2007. So we're going from that system where you got assets, and it's the same with nuclear. If we could have had nuclear in Australia, assets that can run for 50 or 60 years. Instead, we're going to install vast amounts of solar panels across landscapes, desecrating landscapes across Australia and on rooftops. And then these things have a life, if you're lucky, 15 years. And then you've got to replace them. And who are we going to buy them from? Well, we've got to go back to China and say, please, can we have some more solar panels to supply the system that we have? The wind factories, again, you're looking at, say, 20 years life. And again, the preponderance of suppliers, not quite all of the market, but the preponderance of suppliers from China. That is not conducive to energy security. When you build a system which relies on a constant supply of solar panels and wind turbines from the country that is the most destabilising force in global affairs, and with all sorts of terrible scenarios coming up. That is not conducive to energy security. Energy security is a strong grid built on base load energy that we can produce here and protect. And so I've got another point to make,
Yes,
but I
please.
should let you jump in. So.
No, please finish.
Well, and then the other aspect is, if you've beggared your economy, if it is impossible to make things in this country because energy is so expensive, and that is the realm in which we are, how can we build the local facilities for the mines and the missiles and the drones that we need for our workforce? You know, in World War II, and you're a student of military history, Dev, you know, we decided that we needed a military aircraft, and they were producing them at Essendon Airport about a year after, you know, they'd actually made that decision. They went and got some designs from America, and they tooled up, and we could make things. The reason why people aren't making things in Australia at the moment is because a combination of insane energy costs, the labour laws, dealing with the unions, the cost of infrastructure, building infrastructure. So we're not getting that defence industry which sits underneath national security. And our other work, of course, is meanwhile the government is only spending 2% of our GDP on defence. We said it should, even by the end of this term of government, it should get to 3%. And now we're looking at 3.5 and 4, which is the challenge the Americans are putting. And I don't want to do it to please the Americans. I want to do it because we actually need to spend that money to build the capabilities for our military that we need.
Mm-hmm. As in, we have also observed that the numbers of people, number of armed forces recruits are the challenge to attract more people who are joining the military and our armed forces. What's that trend looking like? Because it's been happening for quite some time now. So is there a cause and an effect?
Well, I think there's a couple of candidates, and I think all of them have some explanatory power. One of which is if we're in a culture with an education system where simple national pride is seen as something that is problematic. If students are taught that, you know, basically this is a, you know, settler colonialist society that expropriated the land from the indigenous peoples, and we should spend most of our time with guilt-ridden apologies. It's not something that really inspires young men or women to want to go into uniform and sign up to defend that country. And we did some polling after the start of the Ukraine war on, you know, would you actually fight, and for Australia, and the numbers were quite disturbing. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on pride in Australia, but the other part of it is when the military is underfunded, when they do not have equipment. It's also very hard just for young men and women to say, yeah, that would be an exciting career to go in. We decommissioned the helicopters. So if you were looking forward to a career as a helicopter pilot, well, you can forget about that, for instance. So there's not, our Navy is shrinking. So there's fewer and fewer opportunities to deploy. We have a massive gap in our submarine workforce. So by underfunding the military, you're just not creating a military that people want to join. So I think we're now about 5,000 under the actual target. That's a national disgrace. And we actually said in our book, No Higher Priority, that we thought it was something that demanded prime ministerial attention, and we suggested that he set up a council of eminent Australians to mobilise a national effort, because it's at the intersection of government policy, defence policy, and really national culture. And we had some ideas on how to do that, but I'm still waiting for Richard Marles to get back to me on that. So,
I think from there, I would. Can you also lay a bit of a context on the geopolitical challenges we are facing from a defence point of view? Because, you know, that things keeps on coming up, because there are quite a few neighbours we have, and we're not probably at the best place to, you know, defend ourselves, which has been told by multiple people at multiple occasions. So how do you see that the geopolitical stability or instability playing out in the coming years?
So I mentioned the book No Higher Priority, which we produced with defence experts Peter Jennings, Michael Shoebridge and Marcus Hellier, because we're deeply, deeply concerned about the situation in which we find ourselves. And there are others who are perhaps have more expertise in geopolitics, but we did dive into it a fair bit. And the major shift that, of course, that's happened is Australia for a long time was providing expeditionary forces to support allies. Vietnam being the prototypical example of where, or even the Gulf Wars, where we were providing military forces to support allies, as part of maintaining a global order or a desired global order. We're now in a radically different situation because the rising belligerent power is the People's Republic of China. It's a one-party state controlled by the CCP and in an increasingly autocratic manner under the leadership of Xi Jinping. And so this is essentially in our backyard. So the flashpoints, of which Taiwan is only one, but the most prominent, in the South China Sea. These are our friends, neighbours in the Philippines, in Malaysia, in Japan, who are very, very concerned. So this is happening in our backyard, and it would be, although it is said by some that we could, it is ludicrous to suggest that we could, in the event of conflict, sit this one out. We are inevitably part of any conflict scenario. We have 2,500 Marines in the Northern Territory, just for example, and there's very good reasons for doing that, and indeed we should probably have more. Our national interests are at stake, and so the continent of Australia, its island chains, its maritime waters, suddenly come into play. So we've had the circumnavigation of Australia during the election campaign by 3 Chinese warships. That is giving Australia the middle finger and saying we do not respect your sovereignty. We do not respect your territorial waters. Live fire exercises in the Tasman Sea. And so we need to increase our defence spending back to at least the levels of the Cold War, if not beyond. And it's not to mount expeditionary forces. It's not about sending troops to help out the Taiwanese in the event of a conflict with China. It's about defending our own lands and waters, and making sure that we have the mines, missiles, drones, the Air Force, the long-range bombers, getting these darn submarines working. So that's driven by the geopolitics of a rising China, and it's not imaginary. Xi Jinping told the People's Liberation Army to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. And he said that quite some years ago, and we've had years to prepare. We said it again and now reminded everyone again in our book last year, but there's still no signs of action or urgency from Canberra. It's really quite distressing.
Wow. We sit here post the federal election and the state election here in WA. One of the things most of the analysts are saying is the shift in demographics and then shift in trends. Could you also explain that thought of either what happened in terms of the shifting voting and also the other idea of where the preferences go, because Greens have been wiped out completely, and then they were probably seen as a big force in the upcoming election, the gone election.
Yeah, it was certainly a remarkable election. In terms of the demographics and the idea that there are incredible social shifts that were behind the election result, and that this signals the end of the so-called conservative parties of the right, or poses an existential threat to the Liberal Party. One word of caution on that would be that as late as November, December last year, the opinion polls were tracking relatively evenly. Peter Dutton never really became the the preferred Prime Minister of many Australians. But if there had been an election in November, December, certainly the opinion polls suggested that perhaps there might, most likely a minority government. So it was certainly a stunning outcome for the ALP, but as you say, driven by preferences. So the ALP essentially, I think it was 33% of the primary vote.
Yeah.
And so that does not, in some way, signal some kind of permanent and remarkable shift to the left in Australian politics in and of itself. So I do have that note of caution. It doesn't mean that the Conservative parties don't have enormous challenges, but it is in their hands to just say that this is demography or fundamental shifts in values is not borne out by the evidence. There are my colleague Daniel Wild, I think, was quoting the ANU values survey, and the core values of Australians. This is a free and democratic society, and they change only slowly and not dramatically. So that's a roundabout way of saying the demographics are interesting. It's always good to pull apart election campaigns and look at the voting trends. And there was a lot that the Liberal Party did to seemingly alienate key constituencies during the election, but I don't think that necessarily signals some kind of fundamental and permanent shift in the Australian public.
What do you see that very close to wiping out of Greens? What is that trend, or what do we, give that credit to or discredit to?
Well, I think it certainly. They disgraced themselves as a party. I think over their obsession with Palestine. There was long-time supporters of the Greens who had been drawn into it because of their identification as an environmental movement, because of their concerns, however ill-founded, about climate change and so on. And suddenly there was the leadership seemingly obsessed with whatever Israel was doing, as if that was the number one issue that Greens should be prosecuting in the Parliament. And there was certainly a growing perception that it had drifted away from its environmental and social purposes. There was a not unfounded view, the famous metaphor of the watermelons, green on the outside but red on the inside, that some of the more activist members really were going down a radical left framework, and so that alienated some of the middle class supporters, and then conversely the Labor Party was attacking them from the left for not getting on board some of the Labor Party programs like housing and so on. So I think between their failed repositioning on radical left wing issues, plus their perceived unwillingness to work with the ALP on the sort of things that the left cares about, they got caught in a pincer movement, and well deserved. They deserved what they got, I feel, and at least it avoided the scenario of minority government. All that said, of course, they still hold the balance of power in the Senate, essentially. So they still will wield a lot of power, but they're not going to replace the ALP anytime soon as the primary force on the left in the House of Representatives.
In conclusion, if you want to, I would like you to share from the future outward looking, what are the top 3 economic reforms Australia needs right now? Should be on the table to discuss right now.
The first one is I suppose the meta reform, which is simply the size and role of government. We have to reduce the size of government. So if you look at something like what President Milei is doing in Argentina, this is a radical transformation in the amount of GDP that's being funneled into the public sector. When you can return that to the private sector, that's when you start to see investment grow, when households can actually accumulate capital and start to invest. and entrepreneurs can get underway. So smaller government, lower taxes, unleash that economic experience. So that's the meta level reform. The second priority for me would be abolish the net zero by 2050 target and abolish the subsidies to renewables that are destroying the energy system, because it's not just that there's costs for businesses and households, although there are. Energy is a foundational input to virtually every economic activity in the country. There's second, third, fourth order effects all the way back through the supply chain. This is a massive, crushing blow to productivity in this country. And we're not going to return to a manufacturing sector. We're not going to be able to build a defence sector until we can get those energy costs back to a level that we know we can do, because we have such abundant resources. We are blessed as a nation with resources which we export, but we are not allowed to use here. We export uranium, but we can't build nuclear reactors. We'll export coal while we're closing down our coal-fired reactors. We're exporting gas while we're restricting exploration for domestic gas in Australia. And so the second one would be energy, and then we could probably run a bit of a lottery on the third, but I would say the insane growth in regulation in this country, what we might call red tape, in every endeavour, state and federal regulation, big ticket items like, say, the nature positive laws, which are going to establish a federal, environmental protection authority and put bureaucrats in charge of approving projects. That's just one example, but right across in every industry, there are just literally tens of thousands of pages of legislation that are crushing businesses, meaning incredibly long approval timelines for projects that can create jobs and wealth. So that would be the thing: reduce the size and reach of government, so that we can lower taxes and unleash prosperity, stop net zero by 2050 and stop the mad rush to so-called renewables. And the third would be to slash red tape.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Dev. Good chat.
Good chatting to you.